The exhibition is entitled Votes for Women, A Visual History, and we're presenting it here at the Brandywine River Museum of Art from now through the beginning of June. The exhibition is here partly in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which is the amendment that granted, guaranteed, gave, whatever word you might want to use, women the right to vote. It meant that sex was no longer a barrier to voting. And so now we're looking back 100 years at the visual history of the suffrage movement, especially those last few years that were so important. And the visual history is something a lot of other institutions aren't addressing, but we as an art museum are able to really delve into the visuals of the movement because we're so used to looking at visuals and understanding the storytelling aspect and the way that visual arguments can be made, and looking at the suffrage movement through the visual lens, it really tells a different story than all the texts and speeches have over the years.
This is the commemoration of the 19th Amendment, so the League of Women Voters, which is 100 years old in Radnor, is 100 years old as well. It's an older league, and we wanted to commemorate it, and this was one of the perfect places to come. As our vice president said, Barb Schrodenbach, why wouldn't you come to a museum like the Brandywine Museum with all its beautiful graphics? And the collection is just stunning here, so it's really just so impressive. We've enjoyed the visit, and our docent was super, so it's been a fun way. And it's amazing how much we sort of knew already, but to see it visually and organically. We found out about the purple hair. These mannequins have purple hair because that's one of the League of Women Voters' historic colors. So it's been a wonderful trip here today.
This is something Amanda's been working on. The curator, Amanda Burden, has been working on for a couple of years now, knowing that this was going to be the year celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. You know, with all of the curators, this is something that, a topic she was diving into and exploring and doing research on. And so it's something she brings to the table. This is her baby. This is years of hard work and scholarship that's finally come to fruition.
So a curator for an exhibition at an art museum is responsible for many years in advance of preparation, having the idea to begin with that would be something that's of scholarly interest, of interest to the general public, is going to be interesting to look at as well because it has to have objects that we can bring to the museum. After the idea is formed, a proposal comes after that, which we present to our various constituents like board members and directors and other curators, other institutions. And sometimes in different exhibitions, we get collaborators and partners to come on board at that point. And then the shepherding process begins once everything is on board, and we schedule it often 3 years in advance. And begin the process for this exhibition of going to see each of these objects in person where they lived. So finding them in the first place at libraries, archives, some universities, museums, private collections, and evaluating them. And there were hundreds and hundreds and thousands of objects to be looked at to select the 250 or so that are on view here to make a narrative, to make a story. We even call it a script that we write to go along with the exhibition so that people who come into the exhibition kind of see a story develop. And your message, overarching thesis of the exhibition is communicated successfully.
I think people are really excited to come here with their families, with their daughters, to come and see what this exhibition is about. It's very timely right now. I mean, we're seeing organizations across the country, whether they're, museums or other smaller organizations that are putting their stamp on this moment in history of how they're commemorating the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. And I think what we're doing here in such a visual way is really true to us as an art museum, and it's just a different way of telling that story, and I think people are really responding to that.
This one we knew was going to be big and complicated because we're used to showing paintings on the wall, but because there are so many different kinds of objects here, we sought out some professional help from designers and an architect who are skilled in creating layouts for exhibitions that have objects, that have costume, that have a lot of cases. And so I started meeting with them almost 2 years ago to begin to tell them the story and develop the script with them. That way, the story I wanted to tell came across visually. So they're true experts in visual communication. So when I could say I want the overwhelming image coming in to be of being part of a march, they helped me figure out how we could do that in the exhibition. And as you enter our exhibition, you see a number of mannequins sort of marching straight at you wearing costumes. So we're here in the exhibition, and one of, I think, the first major walls of the exhibition displays 5 big banners that have to do with marches that took place during the suffrage campaign. Marches and demonstrating in the street was a way that women who were advocating for suffrage made themselves visible. And so a lot of what we look at in this exhibition is how someone who felt invisible made themselves visible to the public, and therefore their cause became visible as well. And so marches and parades and demonstrations were among those key strategies that women used. Often they marched under banners to let people viewing the demonstration know who they were and what they were there for. So you'll see banners that have to do with states. So we have the Pennsylvania banner here, and this is one of many, I'm sure, Pennsylvania banners. These are all borrowed from the National Women's Party, and that was an organization that was working in the teens up until today for women's rights. They also marched under their professions, so we have the artist's banner here in the exhibition, which is very special to us, but you'll see in our photo murals that the American nurses had a banner as well when they marched. 2 of the other banners that you see are ones most likely used in what's called the Silent Sentinel campaign, and they had slogans on them like working women need the vote, or failure is impossible, that were key campaign slogans. And then there's one banner in particular that's in sort of the form of an American flag, and it has votes for women appliqued across the front of it, and instead of a field of stars, it has the Pennsylvania Keystone. And so this kind of handmade and hand-stitched aspect to the banners that women carried, I think really harkens back to, and intentionally so, to the revolutionary generation and to that role that Betsy Ross is so well known for, of stitching the American flag. Now, that may not be true in actual historical fact, but at the time, early in the 20th century, it was an American folktale that people embraced and loved. And so to associate these revolutionary women of the suffrage movement with those revolutionary women of a different century made a great impact.
Now,
we're here in front of a section of the exhibition that's about a protest called the Silent Sentinels. And it relates a little bit to the parades and the marches, but instead of marching down to the White House, women just stood in protest at the gates of the White House. They stood silently, hence the Silent Sentinels, and they let their presence, their visual presence, and the signs they held with questions and slogans make their case. It is absolutely the first example of anyone ever protesting the White House. So this was a sort of a new form of protest to think about, to take your grievance directly to the president. And maybe you couldn't get a meeting with him, but if you had your concern on a sign and stood outside his house, he and everyone who visited him would know what the situation was. And so the Silent Sentinel protest began in January of 1917, and women staffed this protest from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, through to June 1919. So more than 2 years of protesting in front of the White House to bring their question directly to the president. Like those marches that we talked about earlier, this met often with people who disagreed, people who thought this was an unpatriotic act, especially at a time of war during World War I. But the women had cleverly often designed their banners to be statements from President Woodrow Wilson's own speeches. So it's not treason if you're just repeating the president's words. So he had, in his speeches, been talking about democracy in Europe and democracy in the rest of the world. And of course, the suffragists turned those words around and asked about democracy at home for women and the rights of women. So one of the famous protest banners is, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Now, these women stood in all weather, and in the exhibition display here, we have a protest banner, and it says, "Bear the banner proudly, those have borne before you." And I'll tell you why I picked that one out of the many possibilities, but we've also paired it with costume from the period of both summer and winter wear, and a small display about how the silent sentinels, like some of the other protests drawing this attention, ended up getting the women protesting arrested. And so they were given fines, but they refused to pay them and took the time in jail. And the charge was obstructing the sidewalk, because there was really nothing illegal about what they were doing. But obstruction of sidewalk would get you several days to 7 months in jail. And during that time of repeated arrests, about 200 different women were arrested, but some were arrested repeatedly. And the longest sentence was 7 months in jail. And while they were in jail, many of the women undertook hunger strikes to get their message even further known. And the media did pick up on this, but during their hunger strikes, they were also force-fed, which was a torturous procedure in 1917, and not done under strictest medical supervision either. And so these women suffered terribly, and there was even one night of a bit of a prison riot that was called the Night of Terror in November of 1917, when women were bodily injured, chained to the walls overnight with their hands over their head. And it was that particular night that led to the greatest outrage in the public when they heard about what had happened. And it was that event that ultimately turned Woodrow Wilson's opinion. He pardoned all of the women who were in jail. Now, the protests continued, but he pardoned the women that were in jail, and within just a couple of months, he made his first public statement on suffrage. Believe it or not, he had not made his public sentiments known as the president until 1918. And so this display has a banner that reads, "Bear the banner proudly, those have borne before you." And as I was doing the research on that banner, which comes from the National Woman's Party, it's a historical object that they've had in their possession since it was created in the teens, I found that this particular banner was reused later. After the 19th Amendment passed, it was brought out again for a different political protest, again a protest for a president. It was President Coolidge at the time, because women were then advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment. And this particular banner, I have a photograph of it being used in 1927 to continue the fight for women's rights. So the message of bearing the banner proudly, those have borne before, is multivalent in this situation. One of the other things you'll see in this section of the exhibition is a replica. We have very few replicas in this exhibition, but this object is so rare that we've had to provide a replica of what's called the jail door pin. After the women were pardoned, there was an event at which the women who had been imprisoned were honored for their political service, for their imprisonment, and they were each given a pin in the form of a jail door with a heart as a lock. So we know probably roughly 200 of these pins were given out. Right now, we only know, the entire country, only knows of the existence of 3 of them. And they are in the collection of the Smithsonian and very much in demand, but there are replicas that have been made, and we're displaying one of the replicas here. It was designed by the artist Nina Allender. So we're here in another part of the exhibition that's focused on women artists who use their skills and talents to advocate for suffrage. One woman in particular is the illustrator Nina Allender. Nina Allender, I had mentioned before, she designed the pin that was given to women who had served time in prison. But she was probably best known as the in-house illustrator for a publication called The Suffragist. The Suffragist was the publication of this younger generation known as the National Woman's Party or the Congressional Union that gave weekly updates to their readers about what had happened in terms of suffrage across that last week. And Allender provided cover illustrations and political cartoons for Inside. She did well over 200 illustrations. Other illustrators also had their work featured, but she was the go-to person for this suffrage organization. And so we have a selection of 10 different works by her, drawings that appeared in The Suffragist, and I tried to select a range of works that ran the gamut. Symbols of victory when various events happened, like the suffrage bill or the 19th Amendment passed in the House or the Senate. Others are celebrating the suffrage victories in other countries, like Denmark. Some are politically motivated. You see her addressing directly in a cartoon called The Last Trench, a woman dressed as a World War I soldier, and she is over the top for suffrage, and in that last trench is a politician standing in her way. And there are a couple of even more serious images we find in the imagery related to the suffrage movement. A lot of times women are depicted as bound, gagged, chained, in some way restrained. And on one hand, it capitalizes on the kind of popular image of the damsel in distress, right? So some of the illustrations indicate that, where a woman is chained or bound by things like unequal pay. And she is trying to get assistance from Uncle Sam, for instance, but instead of actually untying her, giving her equal pay, he gives her a bouquet of flowers. So Nina Allender was kind of the visual, kind of a steady, continuous visual story of suffrage in its last few years. And so I think it's very important for an art museum to show just how important an artist is in that campaign and the cause as well. So one of the aspects of the suffrage movement that we wanted to be clear to convey in this exhibition, especially in a visual way, is the fact that there were many women of color involved in the suffrage movement. I think in our traditional histories, and particularly in the photographs that you usually see, you don't get the sense that there are a lot of African American women or women of color involved. But that is a condition of who was taking the pictures and who was preserving the pictures and writing the histories. And in fact, when you delve in and do the research, African American women were very active and involved with the suffrage movement, as they were also involved in things like abolition, anti-lynching, other civil rights issues. So it wasn't just a single issue of importance for the African American community. It was part of a larger social justice project. So in the exhibition and in the mural that accompanies the exhibition, we both delve into certain special stories, like the story of Delta Sigma Theta, which is the very first, rather the only African-American organization to march in that important Washington, D.C. parade. And as you can imagine, there was great controversy over whether women of color would be even allowed to be in the parade, and there was negotiations up until the last moment. Delta Sigma Theta was a newly formed sorority at Howard University, and this was their first public act to march in the parade. And so delving a little further into that history, I realized in terms of the visuals, it was very much in keeping with an African American form of organization and style of protest to use one's own portrait, to use one's own image to support your cause. So it's like a personal endorsement. And the portraiture is reflected here in our exhibition, but then also realizing that so many women of various and diverse backgrounds have not been represented in the standard histories. We selected 14 women of all sorts of backgrounds who were critical in one way or another to the suffrage movement in their regions, in their cities, in their states, or nationally. And we commissioned 5 illustrators, 5 women artists, to do their portraits. And so those portraits, along with their biography, are in a mural that we call the hidden figures of the suffrage movement. So it kind of is a theme we recognize from recent other hidden figure kinds of stories, like the women who worked at NASA but had not had their stories told. And so you can look through that wall and see, for instance, Ethel Cuff Black, who is one of the founders of Delta Sigma Theta and a native of Wilmington, Delaware, represented on that wall. There are people you might already know the names of, like Sojourner Truth, who is readily associated with the abolition movement, but also her most famous speech was "Ain't I a Woman?" and she really advocated for women's rights. So I think we have the visual history through a lot of historic documents and objects and images in the gallery, but we add to it the visual story that is even rarer through the commissioned work in the mural. And so it's a great educational aspect to the exhibition as well. One of the things, and it's a happy ending story for us, is that so much of the material we borrowed from the National Woman's Party, which had been in their organization since the day it was made, whether it's the cartoons that Nina Allender drew or whether it's the capes that women wore in marches or the banners they held, had been for over 100 years in storage. And they were in poor condition. They needed conservation, and conservation of textiles and works on paper is an expensive process. It's a lengthy process. We have to take great care, especially with textiles, because those fabrics can break, and they're brittle, they're dry, they can break so easily. So part of the challenge was to be able to select the works that were in good enough shape that could be exhibited, but also to find ways to fund the conservation of those works so that they could be around for another 100 years. So we were able to find grant funding and support to kind of help to preserve the story of the nation. When it came to women's history, it was not always the most well taken care of objects in a collection. So the conservation story that's behind this is kind of unseen, but to be able to put this on, it had to be done.
I really liked the pieces they had on the women of color and of diversity who were represented here, because I think that's often overlooked in the fight for women's rights, because I think we spend a lot of time, and not that we shouldn't, the women get the right to vote, but it was not for many years after that until blacks and others also received that privilege.
I've always appreciated what we have here in America. As an immigrant to the United States, I appreciate the freedoms we have. And it's the little stories hearing, like when the women who went on hunger strike and then they did the forced feeding, and when the Dawson described how they forced the women to eat, where they put a metal clamp to open up their mouths and put the tooth down, I said that's what they do for geese, forced feeding of geese to make foie gras. I'm like, you don't treat animals that way, you don't treat people that way. I saw how pervasive the women were working to get the vote. So it was in the way they dress, with the yellow rose, the pins, the colors of their clothing, as well as all the media that was available to them, the magazines, the broadsides, postcards.
Well, I think it's important always to have the historic record of any struggle, so you can accurately understand what the depth of sacrifice and effort. And to see this, it really brings home to how much the women were so devoted, and men, as it turns out. And then there was also the interesting thing how there were females in the country that really were against it. So it wasn't just a, yes, cheerleader, let's go vote kind of thing. There was a lot of struggle that they went through to do it.
Do you think enough women are going to come and visit this exhibit?
I would hope they would, because I think then they'll grow in their appreciation of what we have today and why it's important that we continue to vote and have a voice so that we can maintain these freedoms that we've fought hard to obtain.
Do you think enough men will be coming to this exhibit?
I hope they do, because they had mothers and they had sisters, and they wouldn't be here without their mothers.